Welcome to the Guardians of Hope podcast, where we bring together parents, nonprofits, legal, and medical experts dedicated to positively impacting children's lives. I'm your host, Cynthia Ramsaran. The thoughts and opinions of my guests are not necessarily my own, so thank you all for joining and sharing. Welcome, everyone. Today, we confront a silent crisis, the epidemic of loneliness plaguing men, driven by emotional suppression. Joining us is Brandon Bishop, an emotional intelligence educator and author of The 7 Anchors of Emotional Intelligence. Brandon experienced firsthand how culture punishes boys for showing vulnerability and kindness. He transformed that painful experience into a mission, helping men reclaim the emotional capacities that were stripped away from them. Brandon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Cynthia. It's my pleasure.
Of course. So why don't you start by telling me more about your experience and your work?
Yeah. So when we talk about my experience with emotional intelligence started from an early age. Um, my professional education experience started actually in a chemistry classroom. So when I first started down the education route, I was a chemistry teacher. But my emotional intelligence journey began when I was a child. So my experience hasn't been studying emotional intelligence, and getting my PhD in sociology. I mean, we have Daniel Bloom and Brene Brown and so many others who are doing great work in that area. So my experience has all been lived through personal experience. It's, me discovering the 7 anchors of emotional intelligence has been through difficult life experiences where I had to choose, sometimes in really difficult situations, um, and maneuver in life, with self-awareness and empathy. So it's really life experience.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that, Brandon. Now, you talked when we initially spoke before the podcast recording, you told me you were raised without an emotionally supportive male role model, and you were bullied for expressing natural traits like kindness and sensitivity. Can you take us back to that pivotal moment when you realized the culture around you was actively punishing boys for being emotionally available?
Yeah, it's difficult to pin down an exact moment because culture
Hmm.
is ubiquitous and it's all encompassing in our environment. So when you talk about an exact moment when I realized I was being shamed, I think a lot of people would recognize that most boys are told growing up, if they ever show any emotional vulnerability, like crying, for example, you're told not to cry, you're told not to, be a sissy, you're told to man up. And those experiences, even if they aren't direct, even if they're observed, they make an imprint on your psychology. And boys learn from an early age that it isn't okay to be seen emotionally vulnerable. And again, whether that's from a direct attack or if it's just from observing others, maybe in a sports team, or maybe it's a brother or a cousin. This indoctrination, I'll call it, happens at a really, really it begins at an early age, but also is so pervasive. I think it's hard for any boy to pinpoint a specific moment where they realized they were being punished for it. Um, does that answer your question?
Yeah, why don't we talk back to or look back at what it felt like as a child and maybe
Mhm.
how it shaped your understanding of what boys and men were supposed to be, right?
Right. Yeah. So you learn, at least I learned, to suppress certain parts of myself.
Hmm.
So I think that's what boys learn to do. They learn to suppress. They learn to suppress their fear. They learn to suppress their sadness. They learn to suppress very natural core parts of the human experience because they're supposed to, quote unquote, be a man or, fit some stereotype or archetype that we've created as a society that we've given value to, or that we've defined as masculinity. But really, all those boys who are afraid, or they're sad, or maybe they're more nurturing, maybe they like to play with dolls instead of Tonka trucks, or maybe both,
Mm-hmm.
they're just as much boys. They're just as much, you know, masculine, if you will. But society's, norms, the cultural norms of society and people's beliefs can kind of get inside a little boy's head and make him question his masculinity or his worth or his value in society, and that's the damage, and it's very nuanced.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's kind of what happens to any young kid. They just learn to suppress or wear an armor, just to seem stoic or to seem quote unquote manly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just the other day, my son told me, "Oh, man up, mom. It's gonna," and like that's just like a term that he uses, man up. And I said, "Well, what does that really mean? You're allowed to feel what you feel without genderizing something, right?" And that's a
Mhm.
whole other conversation, Brandon, about labeling things as a gender, about feeling things a way a man should versus women with all of the fluidity that we see nowadays. um, but yeah, it's just so normalized. And I'm interested in learning more about how you put pen to paper around this topic, right?
Mhm.
Your book presents 7 anchors of emotional intelligence: self awareness, empathy, resilience, integrity, growth, compassion, and mindfulness. Now, I'm particularly struck by how you reframe resilience not as an enduring pain in silence, but finding strength in honesty or emotional honesty. Can you walk us through how these anchors work together to help men break free from the emotional armor that you mentioned that they've been taught to wear?
Yeah, so I don't think of the anchors as helping men break free.
Okay.
Um, Anchors are what keep a maritime vessel steady in turbulent waters. So to me, the anchors don't set anyone free. My goal in writing about the 7 anchors is helping other men and women,
Hmm.
actually, anybody, uncover who they are beneath all of the waves of social norms and social expectations. Who are you without the performance? So these anchors and uncovering these anchors, being self-aware, um, recognizing, empathy and resilience. It isn't really an attempt to help people break free. It's an attempt to help people dial back on who they really are, because I feel like who we are at our core is is better understood if we remove the noise of, what type of husband are you supposed to be? What type of son are you supposed to be? What type of community member are you supposed to be? What type of student were you taught to be? All of these things interfere with us connecting to who we really are, because we are performing on a big, big stage. And my goal in the 7 anchors is to help people dig beneath all of that and really uncover who you are as a human being without all of the indoctrination, without the cultural expectations. Um, and I think that's really important, because I think most people are good. Most people.
Okay. So, out of all of the 7 areas that you cover in your book, which one are you drawn more to, Brandon? What has helped you the most?
For me, the one that is most moving and has been the most challenging for me is integrity.
Hmm.
It's it's living your life in accordance with who you truly are, which is an extremely difficult thing for a lot of people, because before you can get to that place of integrity, you first have to figure out who you are, which is that self-awareness piece, which is pretty much the foundation of everything. But then getting to a place of integrity can be really difficult, because the world does expect certain things from us. And maybe that doesn't really fit who we really are. And living our lives um, in complete harmony with who we really are as a person, it's difficult for people to get there. And for me, it was very, very difficult. And I believe that, there's a lot of growth and pain that comes from that, that people don't expect, but it's really important because it's the only time you can feel as though you're living an authentic life.
Hmm. That makes sense, Brandon. So, why don't we bring the conversation back to my mission, which is child advocacy and just raising awareness for people to be their best selves to raise kids, right? We're seeing a lot of or unprecedented levels of loneliness among men. You and I talked about this earlier, with devastating consequences for mental health, relationships, and community. You've connected this directly to decades of emotional suppression. So, what does this look like on the ground, and how do men typically respond when you work with them about emotional intelligence?
Yeah. Um, well, emotional, I guess loneliness is what
Hmm.
it's being called, and the emotional suppression, it can show up in a lot of ways. I think it shows up in the inability to communicate effectively. It shows up as withdrawal. It shows up as anger. It can show up as irritability. And in some cases, that loneliness shows up as substance abuse. It really depends on the person and what their support system is around them. So that's what it looks like on the ground. It could be any one of those things, or more than one of those things for each man.
Hmm. So, one of your anchors that you mentioned in the book is growth, the willingness to break these inherited patterns to become more emotionally fluent partners, fathers, friends. This sounds like deep work, deep generational healing work. Can you share a little bit of what this process looks like for men who are trying to
Mhm.
give their children or partner something they've never received themselves?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing up growth. It is one of the, it's a very uncomfortable anchor to to acquire
Mm-hmm.
because I think the process involves a lot of questioning, like we talked about initially. There's a lot of programming that happens from parents, from teachers, from school, from churches or religious communities. And part of growth is, first of all, recognizing toxic behaviors in the first place. Some, some people walk through life and they just repeat toxic behaviors because maybe they have a great fondness or a great love for their grandfather or their mother or their father. So because they have that great love, they think that those toxic behaviors were somehow right.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than ever critique them or ask themselves, is this the best way? They just repeat all of this trauma and they pass it down over generations. So the process of growth really looks like a lot of questioning. It's first, you have to recognize toxic behaviors. Like if you're a dad and your kid, your son falls off a bicycle and he starts crying, what is your first impulse? Is it to say, "Hey, stop crying, get up and try again," or don't be a sissy, or like your son told you, "Man up."
Right.
And first of all, recognizing how toxic that can be. And I think once somebody recognizes that it's toxic, then they get inside their head and they start doing the work of asking, where did I learn this?
Mm-hmm.
Where did it come from? And is this belief still true? And then what you have to do as an emotionally intelligent parent is approach the situation in a better way. Like, the dad can then, that kid who fell off his bike, show him warmth, show him compassion, while at the same time teaching him he can get up and he can try again. We can teach sensitivity and we can teach perseverance at the same time. It doesn't have to be one or the other. But so many times boys are taught it's one or the other, which just isn't healthy and it's not natural. And we don't need boys or girls or anybody suppressing feelings of disappointment or being upset. We got to be able to hold emotions and not make people feel like there's something wrong with them for experiencing emotions. We can feel anger, we can feel sadness, we can feel envy, but we
Mm-hmm.
have to and we have to hold space for it, because in
Right.
holding space for it, we can uncover what's causing it. And if we can uncover what's causing, then we can start healing. And that's my
Absolutely.
work. My work is to heal people.
Well, that leads me to my last question. It's about kids, boys, men, who, or people in general, been conditioned to seeing caring and nurturing, or even, like you mentioned, your child falls off a bike, showing a little compassion and warmth as a feminine trait or as weak. How do you help people understand that reclaiming these capacities is just an act of courage? And what would our world look like if more men embraced this thought process?
Hmm. Huh. There's a lot of inertia there, because we're not just talking about a Western society that has these very strict archetypes of what manliness is or masculinity is. We're talking about, I think many cultures
Mhm.
across the world who really want to pigeonhole people, um, into certain categories. And it's breaking through that noise is very, very difficult, because I think the first person that anybody is going to look to for guidance is going to be those who are closest to them. Maybe it's an uncle, maybe it's a dad, maybe it's a grandfather. And typically speaking, how those people interpreted the world or perceived masculinity is going to be very easily inherited by the young boys that they're raising. And I want to say, and I think it's important to mention that there are a lot of men who fit very neatly and comfortably into the male stereotypes. And that's valid, that's okay. So my message is, if you're a man who doesn't, and you don't feel like that defines you, and you felt less of a man because you didn't fit that narrative or that archetype, my message is, you belong. Your masculinity is just as masculine as the archetype, and we need more men to feel comfortable being emotionally intelligent, being willing to be compassionate, to show empathy. We need those men who may not fit the archetype to understand their value and to show up in the world and to show up loudly, because the world needs all forms of masculinity and all forms of femininity in whatever it is. And I think, you asked about what the world would be like for
Mhm.
men, since we're talking
Mhm.
about the loneliness epidemic.
Right.
It'd make the world a lot less lonely of a place
Hmm.
when we're more real about all the different versions that we are. Loneliness comes from feeling like you can't connect. And I mean, in order to escape loneliness, we have to be willing to be emotionally real. You can't form bonds with people if you have a facade or a wall between you and your emotions.
Hmm.
And you can't form deep connections unless you're willing to share deeply. But you can't even share deeply unless you're willing to get to know yourself in an intimate way. So it's, the kind of man that would even pick up a book that had the word emotional intelligence on it is already on a journey.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that, that's already somebody who feels like the current archetype doesn't really fit who they really are, and they're just exploring, other ways to understand themselves, or maybe find a community, um,
Right.
of like-minded people. So,
Mm. Brandon, this has been such a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I want to share where people can buy your book or where they can find it.
yeah, so my book's available at all of the stores.
Hmm.
So Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Walmart, Target,
Hmm.
Books a Million. Um,
Great. So, thank you so much for your time and for your work, Brandon. It was great to meet you.
hey, good to meet you too, Cynthia.
All right. Thanks.